Previously on the American Revolution, the British returned after losing Boston and captured New York City, then almost captured Washington's entire army before he got across the Delaware River, and then recrossed it and won some minor battles at Trenton and Princeton. The British won battle after battle through 1777 and even captured our capital city of Philadelphia. But then Burgoyne got wrecked at Saratoga, wiping out Britain's northern army and convincing France to enter into an alliance with us. So if you look up at the top of the timeline, the opening months of 1778 see our army enduring some legendary suffering at their winter camp, Valley Forge. With no buildings, no winter equipment, and almost no food, the army of over 12,000 men settled in for the winter, most of them sleeping outside, most without shoes or blankets. A 17-year-old in the army named Joseph Martin wrote in his diary, "The army is not only starving but naked. Most are shirtless and barefoot, lacking all other clothing, especially blankets. Shoeless soldiers can be traced by their bloody footprints through the frozen snow." Roughly 2,000 Americans died in the 6 months at Valley Forge, primarily of malnutrition and disease and freezing temperatures. That's like 7 or 8% of all the American deaths in our Revolutionary War right there. Those who survived spent the entire winter eating basically nothing but a mix of flour and water, heated over hot stones into something like bread, the whole winter. On April 21st, 1778, Washington wrote to a friend of men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lie on, without shoes. Their marches can be tracked by the blood from their feet, marching through frost and snow. Now, every winter for the American army is going to produce months of hardship, but the months at Valley Forge in 1778 lived in infamy in every telling of the American Revolution, becoming a scene in the story of the sacrifice and suffering of those who served the patriot cause, and in doing so, purchased our freedoms. Again, not every soldier is serving for the same reason, but it's true that the idea of independence and the concept of having their rights secured and respected was the type of motivation that even the lowest ranking private could use to summon their will during those inevitable moments of doubt and frustration. Now, here at Valley Forge, there was one upside to spending 6 months in this location. The army was gathered in one spot and it had time to train. A Prussian named Baron von Steuben, I believe his name was, trained and drilled the inexperienced American forces, helping to slowly mold more of them into a skilled and disciplined fighting force. The guy over there on the left, whose actual name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, is a guy that we simply refer to as Lafayette. He came to the United States to serve in our revolution from France at the age of 19 and was quickly made a major general. He was just injured in the Battle of Brandywine, and now he's at Valley Forge with Washington, suffering the hardships of a camp, of a winter camp along with the men there. He's going to become increasingly important to the American army as the story moves forward. Now, I don't really want to get into these guys any further. I just want to note that both of these foreigners play a pivotal role in the success of the American military in the Revolution. Now, like you heard at the end of the last episode, when General Clinton took command of the British Army in 1778, he quickly chose to abandon Philadelphia, fearing a French blockade. Now, when the British left Philadelphia, Washington left Valley Forge and pursued Clinton and the British as they moved eastward back towards New York City. Their armies met in June 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth, which was truly the only large battle of the entire year, and the largest battle that Washington was going to command until the very final weeks of the war. Now, there were probably about 24 small battles in 1778, and none of them really resulted in a major shift in the war. Even Monmouth here, the biggest one, ended in a draw. But we held the battlefield at the end, and we stood up to the best of the British army. Even if we hadn't exactly inflicted a defeat on the British at Monmouth, we felt like winners. And as we all know in war, morale matters. Now, this is actually the last battle that Washington will lead for 3 years until the very final battle of our revolution at Yorktown in 1781. He has always believed and will always believe, right up until the end, that the final outcome of the war will be determined in New York City, where the headquarters of the British Army is. So that's where he's going to lead from as the war shifts into the South. Now, after the Battle of Monmouth, the British gathered their army in New York. And then, for over a year and a half, there are like zero major battles. 1778 is really a bit of a rebuilding and reorganizing year for the British for a couple of reasons. Number one, when the year begins, they hear that France has entered the war, so they've got to adjust to that news. Also, the elimination of Burgoyne's army up in the north has led to them preparing a new strategy to invade and focus on the southern states. Now, all these battles in 78 and 79, none of them really significantly changed the war in any major way. The British win all the ones in green, we win all the ones in blue. Out in the west, that blue line shows the Americans taking control of the Ohio River during the summer of 1778, out in what was then called Indian Territory. That big green dot and the arrow down at the bottom of Georgia is probably the only other battle besides Monmouth worth mentioning here. That's where the British easily took the valuable port city of Savannah, Georgia, in the final week of 1778, which was only guarded by like 1,000 Americans. So the British took it very easily. Now, this was an introduction into the British Southern Army that we've already hinted at earlier. From there, they moved up to take Augusta, Georgia, giving them control of pretty much the only two major cities in the entire colony. Georgia was the last of the 13 colonies established by the British. And at this point, the colony is not even 50 years old yet. So really, like Augusta and Savannah are really all you need to control to say that you control the economy of Georgia. Anyway, that's one of the reasons they're going into this area is that they kind of expect to have more loyalist support down in the South than they did up in New England. And the bad news for the British down there is that the Southern population does not rally and unite with the Brits against the Patriots. I mean, they never had more than 1,000 loyalists join them at any time during the war. When I say about maybe 10,000 loyalists joined the British during the war, twice that number of slaves in the South served for the British during the Revolution, responding to the British announcement in 1779 that they would free any runaway slave who came and fought for them. Now, 20,000 might sound like a big number, but number one, that's not even 1% of the black population in the South. And the British never really put them into full effect on the battlefield. And you know what? Actually, definitely worth mentioning here is that somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 African Americans served in the Patriot Army and helped to fight for the nation's freedom. In 1778, a former slave named Richard Allen, who joined the American Revolution, said, "This land which we have watered with our tears and our blood is now our mother country." And I'll spend just a second here to talk about the Molly Pitchers. I mean, that's a term that's going to be used for a handful of women who served in the American Revolution. Now, it's true that like 85% or more of our soldiers look like these guys, right? But Mary Ludwig Hayes was at Valley Forge and aided a cannon crew during the Battle of Monmouth after her husband was injured. Margaret Corbin did the same thing at the Battle of Fort Washington, and Deborah Sampson actually served in the Continental Army in uniform, in disguise, for a year and a half, and was even injured in combat. So, the Molly Pitchers, the female fighters in the Revolution, even though there were only a few of them, and the men, both black and white, have thousands of unique stories that really make this story more emotional. But emotion really isn't the main goal here, right? We're all about the success or the failure of the armies and the morale of large groups. Gosh, I hope you're going to read some more about the revolution after this. Anyway, again, I suggest reading some real history by an actual historian for a more like personal touch on what it was like to live during this time. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a historian, but it kind of seems to me like 1779 is the slowest year of the revolution. I don't even think there's one single battle that needs to be mentioned in that entire year. In July, Washington wins a tiny little battle up at Stony Point in southern New York that moves him closer to the British base. And right after Stony Point, word arrives that Spain has entered the war against Britain. Now, that might not sound like a very big deal today, but back at this time in history, Spain was one of the more powerful countries in the entire world. Spain isn't sending soldiers, but this means that they're going to have added problems for the British Navy and the possibility of a French Spanish invasion of Britain. And all those green countries that you see over there in Europe are going to create something called the League of Armed Neutrality because the British have stolen like 60 European trade ships in the Atlantic Ocean since this war has begun, actually belong to other countries. And these green countries aren't officially like declaring war on Britain, but they've all teamed up into, again, the League of Armed Neutrality to resist Britain's continued interference. And like just overall, things are not going the way that the British had planned. So they have to reevaluate and resupply and reschedule all their operations. And like you've heard, that's the thing that can take entire seasons to plan out. That's probably one of the reasons that there's just not much action during this year. So wait a minute. What about Washington? His army is up there in New Jersey, where you see that blue star, not far away at all from the British army in New York, where you see the red star. I mean, why isn't he invading New York? If the British situation isn't going great, why not strike and drive him out of New York City like it drove him out of Boston back in 76? Well, geography, really, if you look up at the map and left there, New York City is pretty much impossible to invade with a land army. Also, remember that Fabian strategy. Washington doesn't need to do anything risky like that. A failed attempt to invade New York City could leave his entire army so damaged that it's essentially destroyed. And for us, the longer the war is, the more expensive it is for Britain. Time is on our side. Our actual move in late 1779 is an attack to retake Savannah from the British, but it fails. The British then set sail from the north to invade South Carolina in the spring of 1780. Now, in the summer of 1779, as things between the British and American armies kind of slow down for a few months, at least as far as I can tell, America's Sullivan expedition was sent into central New York, where soldiers burned about 40 Native American villages, driving the population far into the west. Like 4 to 5 thousand Iroquois refugees, including women and children, were forced to flee the flames. This little chapter in our revolution is mostly forgotten, and anyone who does remember it doesn't celebrate it. Also forgotten, though, is that the cruelty of Sullivan's expedition was done in retaliation for devastating attacks the previous year, like the July 3rd Wyoming massacre in Pennsylvania, in which about 100 British loyalists, joined by over 450 warriors from the Iroquois tribes, massacred hundreds of American settlers, including women and children. Thousands of settlers, most of the American population in the area, were forced to flee the valley to avoid future attacks like this. And another attack like that occurred in November 1778, the Cherry Valley Massacre in central New York, in which a similar number of loyalists and Iroquois killed nearly 4 dozen American soldiers and settlers and hauled away several dozen more in captivity, including women and children. I mean, the accounts that I've read about of the violence on both sides in this situation in this area are so gruesome. I just decided to leave it out. It's some rough stuff. Um, the American settlement out in the West, followed by attacks on those settlers, followed by things like the Sullivan Expedition of 1779, just exemplify this tragic ongoing cycle of land theft and frontier hyper-violence in the West that goes on even after our war with the British has ended. Now, even though some of the Iroquois actually joined with the United States, like the Oneida tribe or the Tuscarora tribe, Most of the Iroquois sided with the British, which tragically fed into the incorrect mindset that the natives are our enemies. More on that in the future. Realistically, all this violence here in the West, or I should say in New York, is actually a minor chapter in terms of the revolution. It doesn't affect the outcome or the pace or the path of the revolution at all, but they're worth mentioning to lay the groundwork for what's going to come in the decades following our Revolutionary War. Okay, like you heard, not a lot of war shifting action in 78 and 79. The British abandoned Philadelphia, the Battle of Monmouth ends in a draw, and the British shift to the Southern strategy while reacting to growing problems with their European rivals. And thus ends another chapter in our story. Up next, in our conclusion, the final 2 years of busy, complicated warfare and the final success of our revolution in our final episode. I hope you're enjoying it. Hope you're excited for the final one. Thanks for sticking with it.